All conscious beings live within a narrative frame, wherein they exist having knowledge of where they came from, where they are presently, and where they hope to be in the future. This is a journey of both time and space, a four-dimensional one. Narratives come in many different forms, and often follow familiar patterns. Not all narrative patterns are the same, though many are shared across sets of ideas. Each individual plays the part of their own narrative protagonist, inasmuch as they are driven towards some goal, even if that goal is simply to exist. The protagonist possesses a particular viewpoint of the narrative frame, different from that of the perceived antagonists within the same narrative framework. Narratives tend to simplify the motivations of people involved within the narrative because human motivations can be very complicated. That being said, we can logically deduce that in reality, a protagonist is not merely a pure protagonist, as they possess elements within their character which inhibit their forward movement in the story. This is known as auto-antagonism, the sort of antagonism which occurs when people get in their own way, in a manner which prevents their progress. For example, not taking care of your responsibilities, not taking care of your grooming, neglecting duties to your family, friends, employers, or co-workers. These are things someone might do which are counterproductive to their purposes or goals. One could even surmise that the self is the biggest antagonist we can face, and definitionally the largest antagonistic element we can hope to change, as we do have direct control over ourselves. It is easy to recognize if someone is antagonistic or not, being that it gets in your way and prevents your progress towards your goal. You can recognize a particular narrative substructure through this understanding. The protagonist also contains antagonistic elements. This creates a narrative substructure in which the narrative antagonist is internalized. The idea being that if you wish to conquer or take care of the world, you must first conquer and take care of your own self. This internalization of the narrative antagonist is the bedrock of narrative individualism. Another example of narrative substructure would be where once again the subject plays the part of the narrative protagonist. However, in this narrative substructure, he externalizes his narrative antagonist. He fails to conquer himself first, and then attempts to conquer that which lay outside himself. There do exist situations such as this where one must neglect their own antagonism and in complete and utter desperation flail in resistance to some overwhelming adversity, where there is no time for self-development and one must fight for survival. But even after such a thing, after defeating whatever Hydra or Gorgon threatened them, they will remain frail and be consumed by their own pathological self-antagonism. It is a notion found in vast swaths of historical mythos, stories, and legends. The war hero who becomes a drunkard consumed by vice and possessing little of virtue when the war is done and long over. So let's explore the more common situation. In this narrative frame, the protagonist externalizes the antagonist and uses whatever rhetoric or propaganda becomes necessary to explain his aims, goals, and ends. It creates a situation where the ends justify the means, by definition of the narrative frame being worked within on the part of the protagonist. In the imagination, the protagonist of this narrative substructure of antagonist externalization may even come to defeat whatever foe he has spelled out before himself. But what is he to do now? He has vanquished his foe, and maybe the world isn't changed to his expectations. There is something amiss. His ends have been met, yet they do not reflect his imagination, his idea. What is he to do? Should he turn inward and finally come to face his internal antagonism and progress himself onward towards self-improvement? Not likely. He is more likely to continue to play out the narrative in which he inhabits, because that is the narrative he has trained himself within. He must defeat some other external antagonist, the real and true antagonist which he somehow missed earlier. He is looking for an excuse to make an antagonist of anything. He in effect invents and curates these antagonisms, often out of thin air. This destructive path leads to chaos and a reckoning which cannot be satiated except by equal oppositional force. When he begins to make the errors of creating antagonism where none exist, he creates real victims, and in effect becomes a real antagonist towards others who are subject to his tyranny. As Nietzsche said, beware of fighting monsters lest you become one. So which narrative is fictional and which is true? Logically, we must assume that reality, or the real world, presents us with non-fictional narrative frames. Real life is not a constructed narrative frame, such as Snow White, where clear narrative subjects are laid bare before you. Snow White is a protagonist. There is only one possible viewpoint in the story, and the evil queen is the narrative antagonist, and there is no other possible viewpoint. If you were to change the viewpoints in such a story, it would simply become a different story. This is because the story is a fiction, meant to convey a particular moral lesson. In the case of Snow White, one might take from it a lesson involving the dangers of vanity, amongst others. Narratives that are presenting moral lessons run only in one direction. The purpose of this is to make sure the lesson is clear, within its self-referential framing of the story. However, this peculiarity does not exist in real life, because real life does come from the viewpoints of several subjects, all purporting as the self-referential narrative protagonist. The problem arises when we start to reject the notion that there are also self-referential narrative antagonists. It is also important to note that we can act antagonistically towards other subjects, at least from their perspective. Rejection of the internalized antagonists in real life leads to projection of antagonism onto others, where the subject paints others as bad or evil, and then they rationalize this projection post hoc, aka after the fact. In the deepest sense of the term, this sort of behavior is a moral and ethical failure of the subject, because they fail to recognize and take responsibility for their own actions and behaviors, and their negative impacts on others. This failure of self-examination can lead to extreme violence, because the subject has granted himself moral license to act in such a manner, and so do so with complete justification. In effect, the end game of externalizing the narrative antagonist will, without exception, eventually bring the subject to become an actual narrative antagonist, which he is attempting to resolve, at least through the perspectives of other subjects actually victimized by the person in question. It appears that the narrative substructures, where the antagonist is internalized, is a form which leads to truth outcomes, whereas the narrative substructures which externalize the narrative antagonist lead to violence and suffering being projected outwards. In conclusion, one can see the difference through careful observation of the narrative perspectives of the given protagonist and how they view the outside world in relation to how they view themselves regarding antagonists.